When we talk about After Effects in 3D, we're actually talking about something called 2.5D. Very few elements are true 3D inside After Effects. There are some, but for the most part, any layer that contains a visual reference within a composition can be turned into what we call a 3D object. However, because the original source of the different files tends to be graphics or images or videos that you bring in from other programs or that you import, they only come in two dimensions, X and Y. They are basically flat files. So when you turn them into a 3D layer, they actually become a 3D rectangle or a 3D shape, but with no depth, with no real depth in them. So that's why we call it 2.5D. So let's go ahead and walk through the concepts of how to create 3D layers in After Effects. It actually is a fairly simple process. Let me go ahead and open up this composition. And as you see, I have several layers in here that correspond to different things in this file up here, in the way you see in the composition. I don't know why I have this layer here. Let me delete it. I don't need it. Everything, as you see, is no different than what we've seen in the past. When I select them, they are separate layers, and they react as such. However, to turn any layer into a 3D layer in After Effects, all you need to do is turn on the 3D switch, which is this switch on this side, right here under the switches window in your program. So if I click and drag across all of these, just doing that automatically turned everything into 3D layers. Now, the difference between a 2D layer and a 3D layer can be evident as soon as you click on any of the layers. So let me click on the topmost layer, which is this one, Ghost. So when I click on that, you will notice that I get this gizmo, which is basically a visual helper that allows me to control what that layer does in the 3D world. The arrows point in the different directions, the different axes that you can move things in 3D. So if you're looking at the colors of them, red represents X, green represents Y, and blue represents Z axis. Z being the depth. So X is horizontal, Y is vertical, and Z, which is blue, is the depth, coming towards the camera or going away from the camera. Now, as I turned all of these things on in 3D, notice that the different transformation values for them automatically gained, those that can be worked in 3D gained an extra dimension to them. So whereas before I had position values for X and Y only, now I have X, Y, and Z, which means I can push things into space and bring them back towards the camera. Same thing applies to scale. Even though these layers are 2.5D, basically they're flattened rectangles, they still respect a 3D depth in scale. So, and this applies because there are some objects that you actually can create within the program that are true 3D, that you can actually control as 3D objects. Also, there will be instances in which we match the camera movement of a composition in After Effects to the camera movement of a piece of video that we captured and imported into After Effects and tracked, so that we can place 3D elements that we bring in from programs such as Cinema 4D or 3ds Max or Maya into After Effects and match, making everything look like it's been one cohesive piece of footage. So that is all part of this 3D world that we're working on. You also notice that we have a new value for rotation called Z rotation, which allows you to rotate things in the Z axis. And you also notice that we have something called orientation. So the difference between orientation and rotation is the relationship between the object itself and the world, meaning everything that you have in this construct in your composition, or the rotation, which is the value onto itself. So for orientation, you can go from 0 to 360 because that covers the entirety of, imagine if the world was a sphere around you, that covers the entirety of your orientation. As with rotation, you can keep on rotating as many times as you want because you are rotating in your own pivot point. Pivot point being where that helper is. And that helper's position by default matches the position of the anchor point. So whatever the anchor point is where that gizmo, where that helper is going to be. Now, what can we do with this helper? Well, you can either use the numbers or the arrows and all the shapes that you see in here to control the rotation position of that object or scaling of that object, or a combination of both. So there's no real right way or wrong way of doing this. You are more precise when you use the numbers, of course, but sometimes when we're in a pinch, we actually just use the gizmo to do things. You will notice that as I'm rolling over the gizmo, not only do I have those arrows, but I also have these little circles. And you notice that the circles pop up every now and then, depending on which one of the vertices or planes I am working on. So if I'm working on the, not vertices, axis, sorry. So if I'm working on the x-axis, you'll notice that I can rotate based on the x-axis when I roll over that rotation circle. Or if I roll over the blue one, that's the z-axis rotation. And you will notice that the arrows indicate that the edge in which the actual rotation occurs. So if I'm looking at the z-axis, which is going into the distance, is basically coming from far away towards the camera, then my rotation would be as if that was my, I don't want to call it a pivot point, but almost like the hinge in which the actual layer rotates. So if I use that and I click and drag, you'll notice that my ghosts are rotating in that direction. While if let me undo that. Well, if I use the y-axis rotation, which is the green one, if I roll over that area until I lock into it, you'll see it. If I click, I am rotating on the y-axis rotation, which is basically that's my hinge. The y-axis is my hinge. Same thing applies to the x-axis, which is this one. Now you notice something very curious right now. As I'm rotating, things seem to disappear. When you turn layers into 3D layers, all the layers are at the exact same point on the z-axis. What does that mean? Well, if I look at any of the position values for any of the layers that I just turned into 3D, you will notice that the z-axis position is 0. That's the default value for the position of any of the layers. So let's press the P key for several of these, and you'll notice that the position value for the z-axis is 0, which means they are all on top of one another. And as of now, they still look exactly as when I imported the file. However, notice that when you create 3D layers, that z-axis does away with the actual hierarchy or the actual position of the layers, which is something we have been working with in 2D. Basically, whatever is on top is the topmost layer is what you see in front, and everything else is behind it. So that works for 2D. For 3D, that goes out the door because now you're working with the z-axis. So where I have the ghosts be in the top layer, if I want to place, let's say, my background in front of that top layer, I can simply open up its position value and move it towards the camera on the z-axis, which either by using the arrow here when I roll over it and I click, or by bringing it towards the camera. So you'll notice that if I go in negative space from 0, I am moving towards the camera. So negative values bring items towards the camera, and positive values push them away, as you can see. Now, this might look like it's scaling down from our perspective, and that is because we're looking at this from the default camera, which is called the active camera in the program. It is basically looking at the world from the front position. Now, you've seen this, we talked about this briefly in the past when we introduced the concept of compositions. If I open up my composition settings for this composition, you will notice that I have an advanced area. This advanced area deals with shutter, and we talked about this as well when we were talking about motion blur. All of these items, all of these things down here reference a camera. These are camera settings. So you're actually looking, well, even when you're looking at this in 2D, you're looking at the world through a camera. So understand that there's a default camera. Now, this default camera is the camera that you're seeing things through, and it's not an actual object. You can change settings on it, but it's not an object. So to create an actual camera to see things through, you would need to create a new camera. We're going to see this in detail in our next video. But for now, know that you can either right-click on the composition somewhere and go to New Camera. You can also go to Layer, New Camera to create a new camera, or you can use the shortcut Control-Alt-Shift-C. So either one of those does the trick. Now, when I click on that, you will notice that I'm being asked several questions as to how do I want to set up my default camera, the camera that I'm creating. You can have any number of cameras in any composition. So you can have a whole setup, a whole studio setup of cameras if you want to, and lights as well. And you can choose whether you want one node or no, but I'll explain this in more detail in the next video, like I said. For now, let me just go ahead and use the default. And you'll notice that by creating that camera, the camera now becomes a layer, and I can choose to change my active camera to that camera. and see the world through that camera. Now, when I move that camera, when I use, and the tool for moving the camera and doing work with the camera is this tool right here. So you can actually work with different tools to actually pan cameras around or orbit cameras around or do all kinds of things with that camera, actually control the camera completely. Or you can also press your C key on the keyboard and you can loop through the different tools for the camera. As you can see on the composition right now, my cursor changes every time I press the C. C as in Claudio. C as in cursor, C as in camera. That C key loops through the different settings for the camera. I'll explain this in detail. Right now, I'm simply going to pan to the side, and while it looks like I'm actually moving the composition, I am not moving the composition. I am moving the position of the camera versus the position of all the other layers in my 3D composition. So I can move my camera around, rotate it, do all kinds of things with it, basically as if it was an actual camera. Now, one thing that needs to be understood about creating 3D layers is that the layers appear to the camera at the distance that at which they were imported. What does that mean? Well, I can go ahead and play tricks with the position of objects on the screen by taking advantage of a concept called parallax. Parallax is what you see when you are looking at things at a distance versus things that are close to you. Imagine, if you will, that you're in a train and you're looking out a window through in the train. Those things that are far away from the window move slower across the window than those things that are closer to the window. So you can actually create this effect of having things juxtaposed upon each other visually by making use of that parallax effect. Now you can recreate this inside After Effects fairly easily and actually gain a lot of dimensionality from that concept. So for example, let's go ahead and take that background object. By the way, let me go ahead and send that background object. I'm going to change its position, and I'm going to send it that background layer, which covers the entirety of my composition, as you can see. I'm going to send it 50,000 pixels into space. 50000. Now, do not freak out. This is now, when you're working in 3D space, these are normal numbers. So working with gigantic amount of pixels in 3D space is something that is expected. When I send it, it's going to look like it shrunk to a tiny size, as you can see, because it was sent so far out into the distance that it becomes very small. However, from my point of view, if I am not trucking my camera in, if I'm not moving my camera closer to or pulling far from the position of my layers, because of parallax, I can go ahead and scale that up, scale it up, again, and now I am not changing the distance, I'm changing the scale this time to fit the same space that it fit before. And the quality of whatever I have in that layer is not changed. And the reason for that is because my camera is looking basically with reference to where the camera is. The artwork remains and retains its quality, even though the scaling value is almost 6,000%. But it's so far away that I don't see the pixels. If my camera moved close to it, meaning if I trucked in, if I just move my camera all the way to 49,000 pixels, then I would see these gigantic pixels because the thing would be just gigantic in front of the camera. But because it's so far away, I don't lose the quality of what I see. This is something we use quite often in motion graphics. We take advantage of this concept. So now, with that said, you'll notice that basically my gradient remains in good quality. Let's do that with the house so you guys can see this in a little bit more detail. So let's see if I can find the layer for the house. The layer for the house is this one, and the mansion. So let me go ahead and push it back in position to about, let's say, 20,000 pixels. 20, boom, and that becomes really small. Now let me scale it up to whatever size. It matches what I had before, which was roughly like this size. So let's say about this size. So it's about 22,000 pixels. And you'll notice that I don't lose the quality of the actual the actual layer. Remains fairly clean. So I'm actually not damaging the actual quality of the thing. Now you'll notice that because that is 20,000 pixels in the space, and it doesn't have to be 20,000 pixels. It could have been just 2 pixels. It is now behind those haunted trees. This one's here, the ghostly trees that you see in the background. not this ones, but this ones. You'll notice that the trees are in front of the house shape. So now we have this basically we're no longer constrained to this being the mansion. Now it's behind the back trees, even though the back trees are 2 layers below them, below the house in the composition. So we do away with the stacking order on these layers when we work with 3D layers. You can combine 2D and 3D layers as well. But know that 2D layers take precedence. So if I turn a layer into 2D, say I turn this background image into 2D, it would be placed in front of whatever it is, because that 2D layer will basically be, it will obey only the 2D environment. So that layer, if I place that layer and I place it on top, it would be on top of everything, because the z-axis doesn't respect that 2D layer positioning anymore. It doesn't see the z as 0. It looks at it from the point of view of the stack of layers. So when you're doing that, when you're combining 2D and 3D layers, know that anything that you're creating in 3D should be in front of that 2D layer if you wanted to maintain, if you want to maintain that layer as 2D. Okay, so that's basically one of the things to know about the setting up of those layers and the stacking order. Now, how do I know that this is actually pushed back into space and I wasn't just scaling things up and down? Well, when you're working in 3D, and this should be something that you know if you come from working in programs such as Cinema 4D or Maya or 3ds Max or Blender, whichever of those programs that you have used in the past, basically you know that you have a 4-panel view. You have the exact same settings here in this program. So where you see here, where it says 1 view in the drop down, we're looking at the world through only 1 view, 1 camera, the one that we have set up on this side. But if I go to 4 views, you will notice that I have basically a similar setup that you have in a 3D program. Because real estate is at a premium here, this becomes problematic to us because we have very little space to actually work with panels or to work with any of these things. A good shortcut to know is that if you want to max out any of the panels that has that little blue highlight around it, simply make sure that the panel is selected, meaning like you see the blue outline around it, and with the mouse over it, press the tilde key, which is the key right above your tab key on the keyboard. It is the tilde key that has the ability to expand that visual for that window to cover the entire screen. Notice that everything else basically got closed. And when I press on it again, it closes it back. So if I go over to my timeline and I select it and I press the tilde key, it expands that to cover the entire real estate. So I can go ahead and roll over any of the windows. You'll notice that as I'm rolling over and I press on the tilde key, that is that window that gets selected. And it applies to any window, by the way. Notice that I can do it on these ones as well. So whatever you're rolling over at that moment where the mouse is, it detects where the mouse is. And then when you press on the tilde key, it expands it. So that is a good shortcut to keep in mind. The tilde key above the tab key to the left of your number 1 key on your keyboard. Okay. You can also change the views to 2 views, for example, and then each one of these views is a different type of view. So this one is the top view. I'm looking at the world from the top. This one is the camera 1 view, the camera that we created. Now, if I zoom out on this one, you will probably notice that you cannot even see where my background layer went because I pushed it so far. It's so far up in this direction that I cannot see it. Let me bring it back to about 20,000 pixels, 20,000 to 3, maybe even less. Let's say, actually do 2 things. Let's scale this down again to about 500%. And let me change the position to about, there it is. It appears right here. You start seeing it appear right now. There it is. So let's say 15,000 pixels. Okay, so that is the position. Now, because I did that, if I go to my front camera and expand this, my background is on top of, is in front of, in the z-axis, in the z stack, it is in front of my haunted mansion, because my haunted mansion was at 20,000 pixels. So let me place my haunted mansion at 14,999 pixels, and you'll see that it appears in front of. When I place it at 15,001 pixels, it gets right behind it, because it is basically on the stack, it is moved on the z-axis past that point. So let me bring that scaling down again to about 200 pixels, at 200%, sorry. And the position, I'm going to place this at around 10,000. And what, oh, I put it at 100,000, sorry, 10,000. There it is. And what did I scale this to? 200%? There it is. So I scale it to about 1,000%. And now I can position it back again where it belongs, which is right here on the z-axis. So that gives me, or I can move it on the top viewport. So if I go here and I select it, notice that I can move it up here as well. And you'll notice that I am moving the stack. All of the layers are here. This is my background and this is my mansion. And I am basically stacking them in 3D space. You also can see this from what we call, if you change that top view to what we call custom view 1, you'll notice that you have sort of a stacking view of the actual world. So let me bring things closer. Let me bring everything back to 0. So I'm going to make the scaling value of the mansion 100%. And I'm going to position the z-axis at 0 so that it comes back to the front. And let me reset the position of this. So there it is. I just brought it back to the center of the composition. Let me move it on the x-axis to the left, on the y-axis a little bit to the top, and I'll place it right there, right where it was at the beginning. Now let me bring back my background as well. I'm going to bring back the background to 0 on the z-axis, and I am going to change the scaling to 100% again. Okay, so now with that done, let's concentrate on this view. I'm going to move that background ever so slightly to the back. So let's change the position on the z-axis to move it a little bit to the back, and maybe the haunted mansion as well, just a little bit to the back. Okay, and so as you can see, things basically get stacked up. If let's go ahead and select those two things and scale them up. I'm going to select the background and press Control, select the haunted mansion, and I'm going to scale them both up to cover the entirety of the composition. Now, when I do this and I move my camera, now, as I did before, take a look at this composition here. You see that the motion of the house and the background is different than the motion of the foreground. Items closer to the camera move faster than those far away from the camera. And that's what we call parallax. It gives you automatically that sense of depth that you get when you're looking at things out the window, when your eyes are a camera. So that is how you create that parallax effect. In order to sell it properly, you need to obviously change the position of your layers a little bit more than just simply 200 pixels or 300 pixels. That's where the 5,000 pixels, 2,000 pixels, 10,000 pixels numbers come in if you want to truly create that sensation of 3D and actually sell it. Note that if you do that, you don't want to bring your camera close to those objects because they get pixelated. There's no going around that. So to avoid that, make sure that you understand the position of the camera with respect to the actual environment, to the actual world. So this is a short intro to 3D layers. One thing to keep in mind as well is that when you turn the layers into 3D layers, you gain a new set of settings for them. Besides the transformation settings, you also have something called material options, which is actually how the 3D objects work in 3D space, and it gives you a new set of settings for properties for the object that work in 3D space only. You also take into account now that you're working in 3D space, and what that means is your computer will look at the layers in 3D, and it will start trying to render them in 3D. Notice that when we activated those layers to 3D, up here under the composition window, we get a new drop-down called Renderer. And by default, it gives you what we call Classic 3D. Classic 3D allows you to do certain things with 3D objects, but it has its limitations. If you want to change your renderer to another renderer, you will either click on that button or right here under Change Renderer for geometry options. So if I click on Classic Renderer, it opens up my composition window, as you can see. Let's take a look at this. Basically, it opens it up in this tab. And then it allows me to select from a list of renderers that are available to you depending on the version of the program that you're working on. As of the most current version right now, the 2020 version of After Effects, we have Classic 3D and Cinema 4D. But if you work with a previous version, let's say 2017, you should have another one called Ray Trace available for you here. It's not, ray tracing is no longer supported by the program, but it was a great tool. It just rendered really slow. But it worked really well. It had a lot of advantages. It just renders really, really slow. So Adobe has decided to go in this direction with this program. So if I choose Cinema 4D, it gives me a list of the things that are enabled and the things that are disabled from the Classic 3D. And to change that renderer, all you need to do is just click OK, and you're done. Now, you notice that not much change here, except now you have more options for your material options, more settings available to you, and you also have geometry options, which allow you to create 3D objects in After Effects, to actually truly create 3D changes to objects. So if you're working with things like shapes, you can actually extrude them to create 3D depth in those objects. You can also increase the amount of subsegments that something is made of. So let's say, for example, I want to make this 32 segments. And what that means is the amount of subdivisions that this mathematically is breaking this into to understand what it looks like. And then I can take advantage of that to make it curvy. So in this case, I'm changing the ghost layer. So let's say, for example, let me go to my background so you can see what this does really quick. And I'm going to go into more detail in this when we get to the to this section of the class. So let me go ahead and open this up, increase the amount of segments for this, let's say 32, and I want to increase the curvature of this, and you'll notice that my background now turns into a curve. Now, when I'm on this viewport here, if I press the Alt key on the keyboard, I can go ahead and rotate my camera as I move around. By pressing the Alt keyboard, I am orbiting that custom view camera that I have for that viewport. Remember, you find it under these ones. So you can go ahead and move around to see what effect that had on the layer, and you'll notice that we now created a curved 2.5D layer, which might work in some instances for things that you're creating for your compositions. So note that there's a new set of settings, and we will be talking about these settings in more detail in a couple of videos.